John, thank you for being with us. He didn't quite come all the way from Canada, although he is from Canada. Where were you last? From
Copenhagen.
Denmark. Copenhagen, okay. So it was a reasonably sustainable trip for us, but I'm really delighted that you're with us. John is one of the members of our international advisory group, and he's accepted to join us for this whole 3 days, which I think is tremendously generous. I've met you a year ago now, more or less, in Taipei. And I really look forward to your contribution. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining the group. And please take the floor.
Thank you, Olivia. It's a pleasure. It's a passion of mine, so interdisciplinarity, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm tempted to say, and now for something completely different, but I did want to make one remark. Euskadi, that was great to hear that presentation because it really brought forward in my mind the areas of agreement and disagreement. The multidimensionality of interdisciplinarity is a crucial point, I think, that you stress very strongly. But I do want to emphasize that we have a slightly different view on normativity. And the only comment I'll make on that is there's nothing more normative than the claim that there is a distinction between the normative and the descriptive. That, to me, is the most normative claim there is because it's disguised normativity. So we can have that debate separately. This is not what I'm going to talk about. The normativity issue is also reflected in this cartoon, one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons. So what I want to argue today is let's get out of the academy, for God's sakes. This kind of endless navel-gazing of interdisciplinarity as really a conversation among disciplines is not helping us, really. What we're trying to do, I think, many people who are actually practicing interdisciplinarity, and I want to take a practice-based approach, aren't worrying about these kind of definitional concepts. They're not even really worrying about disciplines themselves. They're out there in the world trying to do something, and they're trying to use knowledge that comes from the academy. But whether it comes from a discipline or an interdiscipline or not, it is really not the crucial issue. The issue is it fruitful in the context in which it's going to be applied? So I'm going to try and make that kind of argument. I want to start by just saying a word about the language games we've been talking about, all of the prefixes. There is useful conceptual work in clarifying what we mean by our concepts, and we just heard a whole presentation that takes us well down the path of starting to do some of that sort of brush clearing and conceptual clarification. That's quite useful. But there is this whole other dimension of interdisciplinarity as practice. The distinction I'd like to make, sort of in the middle of the screen here, is between a practice of interdisciplinarity, which is really proto-disciplinary. This is where disciplines are getting together because the problem they're trying to address is in between, is in the spaces in between. So they're trying to figure out how to do that. And if it's successful, it actually creates a new discipline, like biochemistry. So that's a discipline-based approach to interdisciplinarity. It happens entirely in the academy. It's driven by problems from within the academy, and that's great. And that's what most universities think interdisciplinarity actually is disciplines talking to each other. Nothing wrong with that. It's great. Let them go and do it. But I want to actually focus on something else, which is a kind of interdisciplinarity that says there's problems out there that need to be addressed in the world. They're not disciplinary problems because the disciplines actually don't exist anywhere in the world except the academy. Like, they don't exist in our lives. They don't exist out on the street. They only exist in the university. They're completely artificial constructs. They have real value, of course. That's why they're there. But that value is inside the academic enterprise. It has consequences outside. But its utility as a way of thinking is internal to the academy. What about starting instead of what the journals are telling us, how about starting from what the world is telling us and defining the issue from the problem back to the knowledge domains of the academy? That's what I want to talk a little bit about. And I think this, therefore, I've never liked the term transdisciplinary for exactly the reason that Julie Thompson-Klein alluded to yesterday, this tendency to turn it into the meta framework, the super theory, the big picture answer to all. form. And so interdisciplinary, to me, that just is like taking us in the wrong direction. I don't want super theories and meta frameworks. I want practical problem-solving tools and processes. And I'm suspicious of attempts to formalize interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity. But if by transdisciplinarity, I'm looking at a professor of transdisciplinarity, if by this we don't mean proto-disciplinary activity, we aren't looking for meta-theoretical frameworks, but we're actually talking about it being engaged with the world, which many people use it as, I'm there.
Wonderful.
These are a couple of the characteristics I proposed a few years ago about this issue of issue-driven interdisciplinarity. I just want to walk through them and add one to it, and just give some examples of the kinds of things, of the way these things look. These are not theoretically derived concepts. These are empirically derived from practice. These are the kinds of things I see when I look out at the work. I've actually never done a project that is disciplinary. Every research project I've ever done in my whole career has involved many people from many backgrounds, and including increasingly non-academics. So this is an observation from a limited sample and from interaction with others in the field. I want to add one that's actually implicit here, but I want to make it explicit. So, problem focus, what do we actually mean by this? Well, there's a lot of literature out there. We heard yesterday about post-normal science, Silvio Fontowitz and Jerry Revetz's arguments that spawned a whole literature about what that means to deal with problems that are highly complex and highly fraught. Mode 2 science, we have Irwin's civic science, we have a whole bunch of these concepts. And what they're saying, I believe in, what is common to all of them, is a recognition that the usual way of dealing with social problems through the academy is problematic. That these problems don't lend themselves to approaches that were typical of the way academics approached issues, which was in a fundamentally disciplinary way. As Julie Thompson-Klein pointed out, that's changed now. The landscape has changed. One of the points I want to make is all of our kind of endless navel-gazing about interdisciplinarity is decreasingly relevant to our students who aren't living in that world anymore. They're actually in the interdiscipline world, many of them. And so all of this whole debate is becoming less and less relevant to a cadre of students that are emerging in a deeply applied interdisciplinary environment. There's more and more programs, there's more and more fields that are just doing this stuff. And I think we need to think about that and not, well, I've said enough. Combining theory and practice is, of course, the premise of a lot of this activity. It leads to new methods and tools. I'll say a little bit more about that. The term co-production has already been mentioned. That's a currently popular version of an argument that goes back quite a long ways. And new criteria of quality. We have Silvio Fontowitz and Jerry Revetz's concept of extended peer review, which has led to a very interesting literature about what do we actually mean when we start giving up control of the research enterprise and allowing non-academics to judge the quality of our work. Academics hate this, and they raise a million, in principle, good reasons why this is a disaster. It's actually really interesting when you do it, and I think it's actually very productive, potentially. It can be done badly, of course. And I agree with Uscali's point about the distinction between good and bad. I was happy to hear him talk normatively about interdisciplinarity. And new evaluation frameworks. Let me give you an example. This is something we were trying to do at the University of British Columbia, where we say, in response to exactly the demands Uscali mentioned from society to be more useful and relevant, demands which I celebrate, I think are the best thing that's happened to the university in the last 100 years, is a demand from society to do something useful in terms of the huge problems we face as a society. So this demand, which is interpreted often in negative terms, I think is very positive things. Show value beyond just training students and doing research which finds its location in refereed journal articles, the prestige of which is inversely proportional to the readership, right? Like we know that. We know the average refereed journal article has 3 readers. That should tell us a little bit of something about our fundamental criterion of quality is that, right? It's producing things that will be read by 3 people on average. That's how we judge people. That's how we promote people, is based on that criterion. So, you know, it should give a little pause, I think, to what we're up to. So I think it's great that society is demanding universities show more value. And universities, I think, have 4 characteristics that allow them to do something that nobody else in society can do on sustainability, which is my field, not discipline, field. We're single owner occupiers of significant capital stock. I put owners in brackets because European universities typically don't own their buildings and land. Our universities do. So at UBC, we have 400 buildings, which we own, and we have 400 hectares of land, which we own. So we're an owner-developer. Now, you take 400 hectares in downtown Lisbon, you've got about 2,000 decision makers and owners, right? We got one owner. Now, it's a little more complex than that because universities are fractal, so they reproduce all the complexity of the universe within their own boundaries. So institutionally, it's a complex array. Nevertheless, legally, it's one decision maker. Now think of that scale, 400 buildings on 400 hectares. I don't know what the University of Lisbon is, but it's not probably all that different, maybe smaller physical footprint. Think of that scale. That's the scale that every city in the planet is struggling with. Urban neighborhood scale. They're trying to solve really practical problems at an urban neighborhood scale. That's us. We're urban neighborhoods. Of course, not all campuses are urban, but the ones that are. So we're single owner occupiers. We have a public mandate. What does that mean? That means we'll accept a 15-year payback on capital investment at UBC that has academic purpose, right? Because that trumps rate of return. In fact, most faculty don't think we should use any rate of return. They should just do whatever they want because they're important. So we'll invest and build stuff that the market won't do. We will invest in ways the market can't invest. No company will take a 15-year payback. We do teaching, we do research. Those are 4 characteristics nobody else has. So we can turn our whole campus into a sandbox, into a test bed, where every single operational decision of the university, without exception, is a sustainability decision. It already is, but let's make that explicit, and let's add teaching and research to it all. And so suddenly everything we do becomes a way of testing out sustainability on the ground and learning from it, teaching it, publishing it. Because one thing we do, we publish. Failure. We just had a paper called Learning from Failure on a building that we built. The market won't do that either. It's not in the interest of a building owner to publish performance failure. And yet green buildings around the world are not performing. We know there's a big performance gap. It's not very visible because of that lack of incentive. Universities, we publish it all. So we can play a really important role in terms of learning from failure. So there's just one example of a kind of engagement that we can do that nobody else can do. This is a role we can play. It raises an interesting question of how do we evaluate the effects of these kinds of engaged projects? Because as I said, referee journal publications is a really bad indicator of this kind of work. It is slower. It does take longer. Iscali, every project I've ever been in of this kind takes way longer. You get fewer high impact factor referee journal articles out of it because you're producing a lot of non-academic products with partners. And so it takes longer. There's a penalty that junior faculty pay for being involved in this kind of work for that reason, and grad students. So how do we extend the evaluation framework and start to recognize there's all these other impacts that should be part of the evaluation? This is a framework Arnhem Veek and I and others developed and tried to apply in a couple of projects. We just recently applied it in reviewing Mistra Urban Futures. David Simon's group was on the review panel. And it changes the game when you start to look at these kinds of outputs and say, if you're doing co-production, if you're doing transdisciplinarity, you have to think beyond the normal academic publications. Okay, integrated. Integrated is one that I'm actually a little suspicious of, because it leads us down that meta-theoretical direction of the super theory, where everything is combined and we have the answer. But I do think there is this sense of vertical and horizontal integration across fields and sectors that is typical of this kind of practice. And complexity is increasingly a part of the discussion in these kinds of projects. Although, my own view is almost everybody using the word complexity tends to ignore the most fundamental lesson of complex adaptive systems, which is emergence and what that really means. It's sort of like scenarios. Most people using scenarios haven't internalized, I think, the fundamental lesson of scenarios, which is multiple incommensurable baselines. It just changes the whole game. So anyway, feedbacks and dynamics start to become important. How do you link the qualitative and the quantitative? This is a huge culture issue in the academy. One of the ways we've tried to address that is a lot of our research in between Storyland. This is where we live, right? If we sit down and have a discussion with our friend about our relationship problems we're having, we don't pull out a cost-benefit analysis or some kind of quantitative model of human relationships. We tell stories. This is how we live our lives. This is how we do research often. Is there a place in between where we can locate ourselves? This is a computer game we built many years ago. It's now been applied in 30 or 40 cities around the world as a way of engaging citizens and thinking about the future of their city. And we've made a fairly strong attempt to locate it somewhere in between Storyland, but use models. And models are useful. They're a formalization, a simplification of reality in order to articulate and identify some key relationships. That can be very helpful. But try showing people in the public the models and see what happens. Landscape visualization can be a very powerful way to communicate complexity because we live in landscapes. So we actually intuit them in a fairly deep way. We're quite sophisticated in our understanding. So if you want to convey complexity, don't show charts and tables on the wall. This took me years to realize because I love charts and tables. But eyes glaze over in 10 seconds when you show all this academic output. Show them a landscape changing. This is just Photoshop. I mean, we have much more sophisticated versions of this. You can have a 3-hour workshop just on that transition of a typical Vancouver intersection into what it could otherwise be. You've got alternative energy, you've got live work, you've got biodiversity, you've got transport mode shifts. Everything that's in all the scenarios is actually on that one simple diagram. And people engage. They really will engage. We pull down Google Earth of people's street, the street they live on, and then on a touch table we alter it. We start adding and subtracting buildings, and they see it happen in front of their eyes. It's their street, and then they see the energy use and the water use and the land use implications scrolling by on the touch table. So this attempt to combine the qualitative understanding of landscape with the quantitative effects of different choices, very powerful way to engage people. Interactivity is all about what I've just been talking about, is the tools and processes for engagement. We started thinking building these computer games was the way to do it. And we realized the actual tool itself is less important than the process of use. And you have to spend a lot of time thinking about how to interact, how to design the processes of engagement with people. We came up with sort of 3 rough principles of what we called interactive social research. Don't start with the models and then try and put a user interface on them to communicate out. That's the classic academic approach. It fails every time, I think. Start with the interface. Design the interface, or what do people care about? And then work back to the models and build models that will feed that interface. You end up with totally different models. And you actually alienate all the modelers because they want to do the models that will speak to their interests. So it's a challenge. It's an institutional and cultural challenge to do this. Backcasting, instead of trying to predict the future, the world is littered knee-deep in failed forecasts. They're all failures. We can't even predict quarterly GDP accurately. So instead of predictive forecasting, let's start talking about where we want to be and how to get there from here. Normative scenario analysis. And then a form of strong interactivity. I'll come back to that. In these kinds of processes, what we find is the understanding is emergent from the process. What does that mean? That means we don't know before we start what the understanding is that is going to emerge. We don't know what sustainability is. because it emerges from the discussion. It isn't us communicating outward, this unidirectional truth speaks to power or truth speaks to powerlessness. That's a very old model, not very useful. Instead, this is a co-production, a co-creation, a co-understanding, a co-implementation. There's all the co-words that are now being used to describe this. So understanding is itself emergent from the process. And so it matters where you involve the non-academics, the non-researchers. Do you just involve them in the use end? That's the very standard kind of educational, beaming out information. We're going to educate public understanding of science. Let's do lots of lectures on cloud physics, because boy, citizens really need to understand, the sink source problem in climate science. It's futile. We don't want people to understand cloud physics. We want people to know about insulating their attic. Like, they're not very closely connected. And yet we spend billions of dollars doing public education of science as if understanding science is important for changing the world. There's a lot of steps in between, and simply lecturing on the science that isn't very useful, I think. So maybe you actually involve them in interpreting the results as well. Okay, well that's a step of a greater involvement, but maybe you can also involve the non-academic partners in the research design or the problem definition, the research itself. Then some interesting things happen. When you do this, you start losing control, right? Which also researchers hate, because now you can't control the timing, but you can't even control the nature of the questions and the type of research being done. This is very hard to do, and funding agencies don't typically recognize these problems of this kind of research. So there are disincentives to do this, but the incentive is it's way more fun, and it's way more useful, I would argue, in the end. So you need institutional protection for the junior faculty, especially, who don't have promotion and tenure yet, and the grad students, who otherwise are at risk. Strong, integrated, interactive social research. Here's another way to think about it. We have expert understanding in the academy. It's important. There is really important knowledge that is located in the academy because people spend their lives and careers building up knowledge of specific things that are relevant to the world. Then you have public attitudes, values, beliefs, deeply, explicitly normative. A bunch of this is claimed to be non-normative. I think that, as I said, is an illusion. But this certainly isn't claimed to be non-normative. Can we create tools and processes of engagement that combine these two things and give rise to this emergent understanding? Emergence, again, is crucial here. Well, maybe we'll come up later. No, let me just mention this idea of emergence. If these socio-technical and socio-natural systems we exist within are indeed complex, as opposed to complicated, as the claim is, then they're characterized by emergence, right? That's a characteristic of complex systems. What does that mean? That means these systems are inherently unpredictable. They're not unpredictable because we don't know enough. They're inherently unpredictable. It's a structural characteristic of the system itself. We will never be able to predict them. That means they are in part incomprehensible. There are parts of them we can't understand in advance that only emerge. That means they're uncontrollable in any strong sense, and even unmanageable to a certain degree. I don't think we've internalized the implications that we live in systems that are unpredictable, uncontrollable, and partially unmanageable and incomprehensible. What does it mean to navigate through a life? Now, when you think of it, that describes our personal lives, right? They're all uncontrollable, unpredictable, and largely unmanageable and incomprehensible. That's a characteristic we're familiar with in our normal life, but that's a characteristic of all complex systems. So we need management tools and approaches, say in urban design, that reflect this uncontrollability and unpredictability. We keep falling back on predictive models and rational planning tools as if they're going to get us where we want to go. Well, then we're not accepting the consequences of complexity if we believe in complexity. Anyway, that's a little sidebar. Sorry about that. Reflexivity is crucial here. I think as academics we're not very good at being reflexive, at reflecting on the underlying epistemological and ontological assumptions we make about everything that underlie our work. That's why I claim that the argument that there is a descriptive approach is itself deeply normative, because it's based on certain underlying assumptions about the nature of knowledge that are themselves at issue, that are themselves disputed. So we need to recognize the multiplicity of underlying fundamental views of knowledge rounds, of discursive approaches. I'll give you just a tiny example. Here's one way we can think of how humans interact with the world. This is a classic sort of natural science-based way that is focusing on the energy and material flows between the human system within the sort of larger biogeochemical environment. Okay, very standard kind of view. And humanity does all these things to the world around. And we're worried about that sort of red thing getting too big. You know, it will exceed the carrying capacity or the planetary boundaries or the ecological footprint or whatever metaphor you want to use. But there's another way of looking at exactly the same system. We don't have a world, we have data that feeds into our models and our tools that is then made available to certain actors that make decisions. Of course, there's a bunch of other things going on too. But what we focus on in this kind of actor system approach is the information flows among these levels. Notice that these two diagrams describe exactly the same phenomenon. Moreover, it's even more complex than that, because each one subsumes the other as a small part of itself. So, from a biophysical system view, the whole human actor system is just a little piece of the human system, which is inside the biogeochemical system, right? So that's how we should think of it. Well, but wait a minute. The whole natural world is only reflected in our information about it. So it's down here. So each has the other as a subset of each other, and the communication is almost impossible across these domains, unless you spend 12 months butting heads and suddenly realize, whoa, this is, what you have to say is important. Okay, partnerships, we've talked a lot about this, I've talked a lot about this already. I won't go into it. What we find with our partners, private, public, and geosector partners, two principles are useful. No net increase. Everybody's too busy to breathe, so you can't ask them to do anything new. Right? They just can't do it. Nobody can do it. We can't do it either. So there has to be no net increase in the joint activity. But there has to be mutual benefit. What is that intersection set between your agenda and my agenda, that you can do your agenda better because you work with me, and I can do my agenda better because I work with you? If we can meet those conditions, wow, it flowers, the partnership. Co-production. So here's co-production. This is from Mr. Urban Futures. They have spent 4 years in Kisumu and Cape Town and Manchester and Göteborg actually trying to theorize and practice co-production. So if you look at the literature they've produced out of that, it's the most extensive example I know of an attempt to really grapple with the concept of co-production itself and how it might apply. I'll give you one tiny example. In Cape Town, they put, I think it was 4 PhD researchers into the city for 3 years. 3 years working in the city. That was a fairly deep immersion of the research and the practitioner agenda. So, co-production. An example, we put students into the city as well. Each year, we had 10 a year for the first 4 years with the City of Vancouver on very precise sustainability projects that the city came up with. They did an internal call within the city. Departments had to propose projects that were very pointed. Then we did a call through the whole university, and we picked students that matched the needs of those projects. Of the first 4 years, the first 40 students, they hired 8 of them, which wasn't part of the plan at all, but just turned out to happen. And then they came back to us and they said, this is so valuable, we want to double the number. We said, we can't double it, we've only got budget for 10 students. We got $50,000, we pay them each $5,000. They said, no, we'll pay. So we doubled it, and then we went to BC Hydro, the electric utility, and the gas company, and we grew from 10 to 30 that year, and it should be 60 this year. And they're paying, because it's useful to them to have this work done. That's a real measure of a collaborative partnership that works if they are willing to do it. So there's a group of these students. The students love it. It's deeply applied. They're engaged on projects that make a difference in the world. That's our Scholars Program. We also have a SEEDS program where we put 800 students a year working on sustainability projects on campus. We have a Center for Community Engaged Learning that puts 4,000 students a year out into the community on mostly social justice and small NGO projects. And like everybody else, we have a Work Learn where we hire students internally, just a normal thing. Maybe we could combine all this stuff. My dream is let's have 4,000 students a year out in the community doing sustainability projects and 2,000 students a year on campus doing sustainability projects connected to the operational side of the university. Entirely doable because we're already at that kind of scale. This is something any university can do. It's really easy. It actually doesn't cost almost anything. And it's a way to engage. It's highly interdisciplinary because the students come from all over the campus. They aren't in a single program. This is part of the problem with sustainability. It's become institutionalized in just that piece of the university. The really crucial issue is to make it something that reaches across all faculties and fields, I think. And on campus, off campus, grad, undergrad, for credit, not for credit, paid, unpaid. You have all these different models. Future-oriented, this is one I'd like to add. Let's get beyond predictive forecasting. We've failed at that, basically. In fact, half of the forecasts that give the right number are also wrong, and they're the more dangerous ones. So I say energy demand is going to be 200 terawatt hours in 10 years. 10 years from now it is 200 terawatt hours, but I had the wrong reason. But because I had the right number, everybody thinks my reason is right. And so they're completely misled. So predictive forecasting, even when it's accurate, can be very misleading. It's, I think, the wrong way to think about complex systems for the reasons I gave. The fundamental insight of scenario analysis is multiple incommensurable baselines. These are not perturbations. These are not variants of each other. These are different worlds. And there's path dependence. So when you start down one path, it gets harder and harder to get to another world. So we better think about that early on in the process. So this is the fundamental insight, I think, that comes from scenario analysis. But then let's be normative about it. Sorry, Euskali. Let's be really normative about it. Let's talk about what kind of future we want. And we now, remember, isn't the academics. These are these participatory processes. And can we get there from here? That's a more interesting question to most non-academics. And so you've all seen, predictive forecasting. There is a true, most likely future, and we gotta get to figure out what it is. And then there's uncertainty band scenarios say, no, there isn't actually. There are multiple incommensurable baseline futures, and we need to explore them, figure out resilience. What works well across these futures, right? That's the interesting question. Not what really works well in A, but what works well if it isn't A, but it's B and C and D. Let's find that list of actions. Then that becomes a really interesting practical policy consequence. And backcasting, of course, let's try and figure out where we want to go. We do what we call second order backcasting because we want to use models, but models all go forward in time. And we want to come backward from the future. So how do you do that? You define some goals, and they're a certain color, just happen to be green here. You use the models to project forward in time. That takes you to a future, but it's the wrong color. So you keep iterating through using the modeling tools until you get the right color future. And then that becomes the goal. Then you can start to talk about the pathway in between. Okay, now let me turn to sustainability and inter or transdisciplinarity. I just want to give you a couple of examples. Start with the idea that sustainability is itself a normative ethical principle. It's not a scientific concept. It is a normative position, that we want a world that's sustainable. And sustainability implies something about human preference. So it has political and normative dimensions. It can never be seen as a neutral scientific analysis. It's an essentially contested concept. I think interdisciplinarity is an essentially contested concept. Like beauty, truth, justice, and democracy, there is no definition that is agreed upon for all time and place. It has to be negotiated locally. Democracy here in Lisbon means something different today than it meant 500 years ago in Lisbon, let alone 2,000 years ago in Greece. So it's local. Sustainability is local. Now that locality may be big, it might be hundreds of years or a large area, but it's local. Interdisciplinarity is local, I would argue, in exactly the same kind of way. There is no scientific definition that is absolutely true. That's the wrong realm. We're in the realm of the humanities and the interpretive social sciences with interdisciplinarity as a way of conceptualizing, I think, not science, and not empiricist philosophy of science either, I would argue. So, an essentially contested concept is therefore a world-making process. Literally, a world-making process. So, must be constructed through an essentially social process whereby scientific and other expert information is combined. This is where I'd argue interdisciplinarity works and fits, is in this kind of process. That leads to the idea that sustainability is itself an emergent property of a discussion about where we want to be that's informed. Here's where the science comes in. It's crucial, but it informs a larger normative judgment, the consequences of different choices we make, different desires we have. It's inherently participatory. So the kind of interdisciplinarity I'm interested in, you can't do it only in the academy. It's just not relevant. There's lots of literature about why we want participatory processes, normative reasons, substantive reasons, instrumental reasons. This is Andy Sterling, based on an article by Fiorino beforehand. I had a PhD student, Nicole Dusick, who added an epistemic rationale and a constitutive rationale, what she called the transformative potential of participatory politics. I think this is a really exciting frontier of where we should be thinking about interdisciplinarity. Transformative potential of participatory politics. This is a computer game that we built. We've used it in different formats. And in Chicago, 25,000 people engaged with this. We now have the ability to reach much larger numbers of people. The technology exists. We should take this very seriously. However, it's hard to see this, sorry. It's very different in a 4-minute experience than a 2-hour experience. You can do different things. There are different affordances, different required commitments, and so on. So we have to pay attention to these different tools. Landscape visualization, show people their landscape changing. Notice these aren't real houses. Greenpeace got sued in Spain when they showed people's real houses and climate change, because they said our property values have now been influenced. So now everybody does cartoon-like, buildings. But you get you can have a lot of discussion with people. I showed you this already. We did a project where we used workshops, mobile apps, tabletop games, social media, performing arts, and computer games, and looked at the different ways and modalities of engagement. This led us to the argument that a lot of environmental and sustainability communication is what you might call persuasive communication. We know the answer because we're the experts, we're the academics, we're the researchers. You are wrong, you're acting badly, your behavior is wrong, you're driving to work, you're not recycling, whatever it is. And so we got to replace your bad story with our good story, and then you will, do the right thing. It's called the information deficit model. What we lack is information. Turns out that's complete crap. And doesn't work. We have 40 years of research in health promotion, energy efficiency program evaluation, community-based social marketing, and social psychology that says it isn't information that we lack, but we keep doing it. So it's the best evidence that the information deficit model doesn't work, is we have all kinds of evidence that it doesn't work, and we still keep doing it anyway. So there's a perfect illustration of the problem. So that's this information deficit. We know, in fact, people often bring their attitudes in line with their behaviors instead of their behaviors in line with their attitudes. As I said, lots of evidence. Could we instead be doing emergent dialogue, where we don't know the story? We have to co-create it in the process. Again, give up control. This isn't academics telling people things. This is academics learning in a process of mutual learning. Cultural change in social practice. I don't have time to talk about that. And anyway, my animation was wrong. Okay, what are the frontiers? I think the frontiers of this kind of work are landscape viz, very powerful way to engage people. Gamification, we have whole demographics that spend a lot of time in game land. There's ways to engage them. They're very intuitively sophisticated with scenarios. Our experience is the kids are more sophisticated about scenarios. The adults are more sophisticated about the content. But it's kind of interesting. Adaptive interface design. Make the modeling and the academic research be derivative of the interface, the engagement process. And then there's a bunch of process frontiers as well. Whole bunch of challenges. I won't go into these, but these are the difficulties of trying to do this kind of really engaged work. This issue of control is huge. People want planning tools, but these are actually visioning processes, on and on and on. This is an important one. Purely cognitive approaches don't work. We don't live in our heads entirely. We need experiential forms of engagement to get out beyond the academy. We're all trained as academics in this, basically how to eliminate everything of normal life and put us all in our heads, as if that is the fundamental reality. We need to expand that horizon a little bit, I think. Time and cost. So here is, I think, my final slide. What are the implications of all this for thinking about inter or transdisciplinarity? I think an important one is this qualitative-quantitative mixture. That brings different groups from the academy to the table that speak a different language. And how to do that, how to talk to a civil engineer about inherently contested concepts, or how to talk to an anthropologist about the structural characteristics of the building. These are the challenges. My whole talk has been trying to argue it's not just about reaching horizontally across disciplines, but vertically to society. That is what co-production is. It is slower. You get less prestigious journals because you're doing interdisciplinary publications. You have way more non-academic publications and products of various kinds. And there's the dangers I mentioned. I think it is important to institutionalize this. This system, the universities themselves and the funding agencies don't recognize these, in my experience, these kinds of problems. So it makes it harder and more risky. And then finally, where I started, a lot of our students are now actually not in disciplines anyway. They're in the kind of interdisciplines that Julie Thompson-Klein mentioned. They're already post-disciplinary in important ways. Many students, not all, of course there's tons that are in disciplines as well, but there's a growing group of students that are post-disciplinary. And we need to frame our efforts in something like this cost action in ways that speak to that constituency as well as to the people still in a kind of disciplinary world where they have to talk about reaching across disciplinary boundaries. So I think that's an important sort of demographic issue. Thanks very much.
I'm impressed. You stopped exactly at 45 minutes. Right. Thank you very much, John. That was a tremendous swift travel through quite a few decades, I think, of experience and work and engaging with the topic. Let me open for questions. Yes.
Yeah.
Speak up.
Yeah. Well, I've seen that normativity was very important this morning. In different senses, obviously. But let's stay in your sense. You said that there are lots of decisions you have to sort of take normativity to define your objectives. I think that in your case, this is a very close connection with the co-participation of the community. Well, but we have also example. I mean, you did it. You told a very positive story. But I mean, there are stories which are not so beautiful. Especially, I mean, we have political decision making in Switzerland, which sometimes comes out not as possible as at least as people would hope So what would you say about this danger?
Yeah, I'd actually quote the previous speaker and say, bad interdisciplinarity is still interdisciplinarity. Absolutely. The big issue is accountability, right? What we have is a political system now that's based on certain models of accountability, voting and so on, and decisions are made in the machinery of that. Then you do these participatory processes. But how accountable are they? And why should a decision maker listen to this process when they have their own whole accountability structure that they're responsible to? And so I think it's a real issue, is as these participatory exercises and practices grow, how do they connect to the formal machinery of political decision making? And I don't have a good answer for that. Right now, what I'm focusing on there's an attempt to create a successor to the Urbanization and Global Environmental Change Program in Future Earth. Future Earth is this new big, multi-everything funding program, if they ever get any money. And so there will be an urban component to it. My proposal is let's take 4 or 5 cities around the world and engage 200,000 citizens in each of those cities in these kind of processes. Easy to do, just costs money, but it's easy to do. And then they become impossible to ignore because they're too big to ignore. Get 200 people in a room, who cares? But then you get the problem you raised. So what's the guarantee that this will be a process that is actually productive or fruitful in any kind of way? I don't know the answer to that. I think we're learning, we have to learn how to modulate these processes, especially as they get bigger and bigger, with the existing sort of machinery of decision making. And we need real innovation on that, because unaccountable processes can often be a very bad thing. So I agree. It's an unresolved, huge problem in the kind of thing I'm arguing for.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very fruitful presentation. I feel for our network also to actually start thinking about how can we work within the urban fields with all these different issues. I wanted to comment on from my perspective, very local north approach towards co-production and also the very high-tech tools that you seem to apply in establishing the interface between academia and citizens or other stakeholders, basically. And maybe just coming to the point that was just raised in terms of how do we institutionalize these processes. At the end, I think we can learn quite a lot from the global south, and I don't really like this tradition, but I mentioned yesterday the transnational networks that we've been researching, and that's exactly what you just mentioned. It's a huge movement of citizens trying to do co-production and to create interfaces in order to institutionalize these processes of co-production. So I don't think we need to reinvent that, basically, but maybe look somewhere else for different initiators trying to do similar things, aiming at similar goals, basically.
I couldn't agree more.
Inventive in their approach.
Absolutely. A lot of work on art and sustainability that is very participatory. The garbage realm, because there's whole cultures of people living in waste environments and that are starting to mobilize politically and develop all these really interesting tools for engagement. Francois Jéjus in Brussels does low-cost citizen engagement, not the kind of expensive stuff that I've been talking about. So there's many different ways. I actually think the most promising is take anyone under the age of about 25 or whatever the cutoff is these days, who's already completely immersed. Their whole existence is immersed online. Their social life and increasingly everything else. So they're already there. They're already in doing this stuff. So let's harness, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, let's harness this kind of process. Let's engage with them because they're already in that space. What we have to do is learn how to be, productive and respectful participants in that space, and then introduce the kinds of issues we're interested in. So I couldn't agree more. It's not a matter of imposing this and controlling it. It's a matter of harnessing a lot of the energy that's already out there. And it will be very uncomfortable in a lot of ways because there's some deep political divides in these arenas.
Yes, Daniel.
I like that a lot, and I like this contextual experiment, etc., etc., etc. Diversity is good, but my question is, how can we, if we have this diversity of approaches around the world, how is it possible that these different approaches can learn from each other, or shouldn't this be a goal? You know, I would still argue that, well, if you have UBC as an experiment, that's wonderful, but you have thousands of universities around the world, and if UBC does one thing, Leuphana does one thing, we have University of Cologne, we have UNAM, and everybody is doing whatever they want. We don't learn from each other. And is this then still the thing we want to have, or should we at least try to have similar procedures that make things comparable?
I would just question the premise of your question, which is the way we learn is by having common frameworks. Mm-hmm. I actually am not sure that's the case. I like the argument that comes out of transition theory and socio-technical regime analysis that says we need these protected niches of innovation. We need experimentation across the planet. That's why cities are a way more interesting jurisdiction for climate change than nation states. So good luck to Paris, but I don't have any hope that that's going to be really significant. It's the city level where all the action is, I think, these days. So let's have experimentation. Universities, cities, communities, transition towns, on and on, because we don't know the answers yet. But then we need processes, absolutely, of engagement, mutual engagement. I don't think we have to have a common framework in order to do that. I think ASU and UBC and Chalmers, to pick one example, we've been talking about doing some case studies, getting some students and comparing very different approaches, right, to these problems. Leuphana would be great to have as part of that. There's Ariana Koenig's book, on living labs, universities around the world. There's lots of ways we can communicate and learn from each other. Look at cities themselves. They really care what the city down the road is doing and whatever they identify as their peer, wherever it is. And so they'll pay a lot of attention to what's happening in those two places, right? And there's a lot of learning that goes on. There's a USDN, ISDN, International Sustainability Directors Network of cities, right? And then, of course, all the city networks themselves. So I think there's tons of ways to learn that don't require some kind of common framework. And in fact, let the battle happen. Let the inter-framework debate is also fruitful.
I mean, it seems to me almost like this is what interdisciplinarity, whatever we mean by it, is all about, is that without that common framework, however, we can find ways of perhaps interpreting, understanding, looking and inquiring into each other's work. If we can't...
Exactly. I think this cost action, a fruitful thing for it would be less about what's the framework and more about what are the practical institutional problems that academics and others have in doing this deep interdisciplinarity, and what recommendations can be made on how to institutionalize this differently. Promotion and tenure is one of the biggest barriers to this stuff because of the way it's structured. But that's so deeply rooted in the heart of the university. The changing promotion and tenure is about a century-long process. It's harder to change that than to change city form. But there's things you can do. So this cost action could have a very powerful set of sort of practical recommendations of how to make more of these things happen, what good practice has been. I don't like the term best practice, but maybe good practice is okay. So what is there out there that others might like to learn about, documenting? I think there's a ton of things that would be hugely beneficial. It's not to say don't work at frameworks. Of course, that's part of it too, but not only. There's this other stuff.
Yes.
I just wanted to mention two small things, perhaps in the kind of institutional learning that we have to do. One concerns assembling the publics that we're working with.
It concerns, sorry?
Assembling the publics
assembling,
that we want to work with. And that in itself is a long-term and fine art, you know,
Yeah,
to get
totally.
right, and has massive ethical implications potentially.
Totally.
And the other one, which also has ethical implications, is because I'm totally with you in on every step, and in terms of my experience over the years, having being part of this kind of civic university model that you're looking at, is that when you send students out, however sophisticated, however intelligent, they need enormous numbers of tools with which to be able to act participatively, and that's sort of never really mentioned. And there's enormous ethical issues as well in their dealings with members of the public, you know, raising aspirations, all that
Yeah,
kind
totally,
of thing.
totally.
But that's not to say you can't implement big ideas. You can't kind of take questions to them, and that's indeed, you know, exactly the way that I do it, through kind of visioning a lot of Photoshop. And you can talk about big ideas, but it has to be done really ethically. And I think that's the thing that's never really mentioned, but actually can provide and in a nuanced way, some of the best results when you actually work with people. But it's not the 2 hours or 2 minutes, it's the 2 years of engagement that really is the most productive.
Yeah, no, I agree. I couldn't agree more. Huge issues of access and who you're talking to. The linguistic issues, right? In Vancouver, if you're doing English only, you're completely excluding large communities that aren't going to be part of the process. And yet the university is, you know, an English-speaking university. So there's issues of power and access, of cultural and ethnic engagement. One of the big problems we have is raising expectations too high. So people engage in this whole process. You know, they spend their weekend or whatever length of time, and then they've expressed what they want. What happens on Monday? Because we're not decision makers. We can't make it.
They're left with nothing then, and this is where co-production becomes just another form, of newspeak. I've been in very many situations of funding in Britain where everyone's talking about co-production. It's just another form. I mean, I've mentioned to people, but eliciting information from people.
Right. It's just extractive research. I think that's why I'm interested in the multi-100,000 citizen engagement, because that's very hard to ignore. So if you do a process and that many citizens are saying they want something, the city will listen to that. And in fact, senior levels of government as well. So that's a hypothesis. You know, it remains to be tested. But it's one way of getting at the Monday morning letdown problem, I think. It doesn't resolve the ethical issues about who's at the table, and it doesn't resolve the accountability issues about how much attention should be paid to this unelected process, self-selected often process. So I think there's a ton of difficult political issues there. I couldn't agree more. But let's deal with them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm saying with those tools that you're saying, and teaching students how to, because we're doing all these things, but we're not actually giving them the tools in which to do it.
Arnhem, Vic, and Daniel are actually, as far as I'm concerned, really pushing the envelope on that.
Yeah.
I tend to just throw them out and, you know, don't formalize that. And it's worked really well for a particular reason we don't have time to talk about now. But the alternative is a kind of more formalized pedagogy so that they have a set of tools that they can use, for sure. I think that's a really fruitful way forward.
Okay, I have 2 burning last questions, and then it's coffee break. Already it is coffee break, but so please be succinct in both ways. So first of all, Giulio, and then it's Scott.
It's something I said even yesterday probably, and I will reiterate again. I agree with the fact that initially you said that we have to go get rid of disciplines, so try to find the problems from the society and to solve it, and that would actually make our life much more easier in a way. And then the problem is how the university can acknowledge that in terms of for the credit that we get for that kind of research in academic path. That's fine. But the solution that is proposed in the end about co-production, again, is a bit risky, because then what you rely on preferences from people, on whether your research is good or bad. And where are you counts a lot, because if you are in a place where the society is mature, the civil society is very mature, like the case that you have shown, maybe Vancouver, maybe even South Africa in a way, depends where you are. But in other countries that do not work at all, again, I'm from China, I just remember that. So how to use that as a tool for evaluation?
Yeah, I agree with you. This reflects a particular cultural background and history, right? And different locations, it's going to be a very different situation. So I don't have an answer for that. It seems to me that there are people out there doing this kind of thing in very different cultural, social, political, economic circumstances. So I would turn to them for answering the question of, how you, and it wouldn't be what we do. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be what we do, because you can't transfer these things across cultures. In terms of evaluation, that's really tricky, right? Because we have a whole system set up that everybody understands in the academy how to do evaluation. And what this implies is a different form of evaluation. And all the literature on Mode 2 and post-normal and so on hasn't penetrated into those accountability systems. It's a theoretical framework people toss around, but then they're judged according to the standard criteria. And the academy, the university is a medieval institution. Right, the turning radius is like almost infinite. Look at disciplines. They're a 19th century, late 18th century invention. How useful are they? Is anybody, what's the process of questioning that within the academy? So I don't know a good answer to that.
We wish we had. Wolfgang. And then
just a couple of observations and the debate. It's called for debate, but the debate will take place during the coffee break. That's what we're looking at.
Absolutely.
The first is about prediction. We need to go beyond prediction because certain things are hard to predict or impossible to predict. So forth. Now the first thought, of course, is that human life, as we know it, would be impossible without at least minimally successful prediction. Otherwise, okay.
Right.
No social life at all. So some minimum predictability must be there. But of course, some very distant futures are very, very hard to predict. But a good prediction requires backing it up with a good causal story, how things would go. And a good scenario also would require a good plausible causal story as to how things might go. So actually, the line between a good scenario and good prediction is not that sharp after all. So it's not, I wouldn't sort of trash prediction just like that.
What I was talking about is socio-technical systems like cities or utility, demand, demographics, and so on. I don't think we can predict those things. I don't think there's any evidence that we can do it. I think there's a ton of evidence that we can't. And I spent a whole lifetime documenting some of that. It's a failure. As I said, we can't predict quarterly GDP. 3 months out, we cannot predict it. There are regularities. Of course, there's patterns. There's degrees of uncertainty about some of these things. So it's not to say prediction doesn't exist. It's to say if it's the dominant way of thinking about the future of complex systems, we're in trouble. There's lots of micro predictions embedded in scenarios, embedded in backcasting. There's a lot of if-then statements, which are, logically predictions. They're part of the scenario construction machinery. But the overall framing is not a predictive one. That's the difference. And that's a huge difference, I think.
Okay, second point and then coffee.
No answer, please. The claim that sustainability is not a scientific concept, but rather an ethical concept, I would say it's both. Just like health for medical sciences, or welfare for social sciences, and so forth. I mean, they have political and moral connotations and dimensions, but at the same time, they are on the scientific agenda. These sciences examine the conditions of health and welfare and meet the means for promoting them, etc. And surely sustainability is not in the class together with beauty as a contested concept. It's a contested concept, but not quite like beauty. Yes.
Okay, you can answer on your way to coffee. Oh no, just do you have a quick answer to that?
No.
No, not a good one. Okay.